Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening, Commodore.
Welcome to the Little Ship Club Club Night Talk, which is entitled Clubland's Hidden Treasures. And I'm here to welcome Reverend Sam Aldred, who's going to give us his talk about his new book. And there'll be time for questions afterwards. Please note that this is recorded for the YouTube channel, so please keep background noise to a minimum, and hopefully, Sam, if you could repeat questions for the camera. Thank you.
Will do. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Yes, so I've come in mufti, but I'm a priest in a church in Wales. I live in Swansea. My wife Helen, who's at the back there. I'm a member of the Swansea Yacht Club, actually, but I'm not myself a nautical man. But I'm also Sea Cadet Chaplain, which I like to get a uniform, which is nice. So I suppose your talks probably are usually about, I don't know, some facet of yachting, but I shall talk to you instead about clubs, and in particular clubs and their treasures. I published this book 2 years ago now, and you can get a copy at the end if you want. And then, yes, time for a few questions at the end. So, as anyone who's ever written an essay would have been told, we need to begin by defining our terms. What is Clubland, and what are its treasures? According to the standard definition, Clubland is the cluster of clubs centred on St James's, which then branches out to Mayfair and Knightsbridge, and has its bohemian fringes in Soho and Chelsea. But I find that geographical definition to be limiting, because although London is the undisputed capital of Clubland, there are outposts all across Britain and indeed all across the world. There are clubs across the United States, Australia, India, Singapore, Africa, Canada. Just about anywhere that the British visited, they brought with them the things that they loved the most: competitive sports, Anglicanism, tea drinking, and clubs. So if not by geography, how else might we seek to define Clubland? Well, there is undoubtedly a certain style associated with clubs. The very word Clubland conjures an image of leather armchairs and suet puddings, of retired colonels in rebarbative tweeds, snoring assertively in dusty libraries. And in certain cases, that's not too far from the mark. But within Clubland, we find a great stylistic diversity. Take the clubhouses. There are handsome Georgian townhouses, sprawling Gothic mansions, and purpose-built, labour-saving modern clubhouses. Some clubs, such as the Beefsteak or Pratt's, occupy little more than a single room. The RAC, on the other hand, is gargantuan. It has 3 restaurants, a swimming pool, a Turkish sauna, and its own private post office. When it was opened in 1911, Thomas Sopwith, him of the Sopwith Camel fame, declared that it looked like, and I quote, a bloody great railway station, and he resigned his membership. The same diversity can be found among the members. If you'll permit the generalisation, the Athenaeum is full of bishops, and therefore best avoided. The savage, hard-drinking bohemians, the Carlton, Tory party grandees, and the fly fishers, well, they're fly fishers. And when one takes in the media moguls of Black's Club and the artistic throng of the Chelsea Arts Club, one sees a membership very much more diverse than our metaphorical snoring colonels. Nor do all clubs share a common point of origin. White's on St James's is the Club. It was founded in the 17th century when there was still a Stuart on the throne. Brooks's and Boodle's are 18th century foundations, as is the Liverpool Athenaeum, the New Club of Edinburgh, and the Norfolk Club. The Travellers' Club was inspired by the Congress of Vienna, inspired both by its booziness as well as by the spirit of international concord that it fostered. There are 2 clubs brought about by the Great Reform Act, the Reform to bolster it and the Carlton to oppose it. Bucks and the Nottingham Service Club are products of the First World War, and Black's was founded as late as 1992 as an archly postmodern inversion of White's. No clubs of note have yet come out of the 21st century, however, which has got off to a decidedly unclubbable start. So there we are. Clubland is not to be defined geographically, architecturally, stylistically, or temporally. But for all that prevarication, one knows exactly when one is within the bounds of Clubland. If you'll forgive the pretension, I'll quote a philosopher to get to my point. The late, great Sir Roger Scruton described clubs as being a corporate person housed in a sacred precinct. That sort of gets to the heart of it. A club is not a pub, it is not a restaurant, it is not a hotel, it is not a mere service provider. A club is a home from home, and so its members become a sort of family from family. In a club, one can, or at least ought to be able to strike up a conversation with another member, safe in the knowledge that you have a shared stake in your surroundings. And as with a much loved, and often rather grand family home, clubs become repositories of memories, places to commemorate family heroes and to tell their legends down through the generations. And that brings us, more or less neatly, onto our second definition, treasures. I employ the term in the book very widely. Some of the objects I've included are genuine treasures, portraits by famous artists worth, I'm sure, a very great deal of money. Others are treasures only in a very personal sense. The relationship between clubs and their treasures is as old as Clubland itself. The very earliest clubs commissioned arcane artefacts for ceremonial purposes. The Society of Dilettanti, whose spectacular pictures now hang in Brooks's, began to meet in 1732. In its early years, whenever a gentleman was elected to membership, the president donned a white toga and admitted the postulant while seated on a throne of crimson velvet. I don't know if that's an idea, perhaps the Commodore. Don't give him ideas, I suppose. The Dilettante's treasures include a ballot box carved to resemble a Greek temple, with the ballot balls deposited between the open legs of the female figure of Justice, and an ornamental casket of Honduran mahogany and ivory known as the Tomb of Bacchus, which is actually a sort of piggy bank. Both of these objets d'art are still displayed when the Society gathers for its extremely convivial dinners. Since those pioneering days, the clubs of Great Britain have continued to accumulate both priceless works of art and the most peculiar bits of tat. And there are quite as many examples of the latter as of the former. Witness the story of Major Hope Johnston of the Pelican Club, long since defunct, who found himself so mired in gambling debts that he was driven to sell his fine set of moustaches and beard, of which he was inordinately proud, to Lord Esme Gordon for the sum of £5. Lord Esme removed Hope Johnston's facial fluff with a pair of scissors, mounted his quarry on purple velvet, and displayed it on the clubhouse wall beside the other sporting trophies. Well, the Pelicans always were a boisterous bunch. On one occasion, a member was accused of having tossed a boar's head at a peer of the realm, sending him crashing into a fireplace. "Nonsense," the defendant protested. "I've thrown nothing but jelly all evening." Well, club members may throw food, but they don't throw stuff away. If something has been in a clubhouse for long enough, then it will be there until the last syllable of recorded time. It does not matter how unfashionable a painting may be, or how gruesome a piece of taxidermy, for it is a holy relic, and to remove it would therefore be a form of sacrilege. The majority of these treasures are presented to the club by devoted members, wishing to preserve something of themselves. Animals they shot, art they made, pictures they drew, that sort of thing. Some are commissioned to mark special occasions in the life of the club. So to commemorate its sesquicentennial, my own club, the Savile, amended the ceiling of its ballroom, which is covered in a rather enthusiastic Baroque scene, so that one of the cherubs now clutches in his hand a bottle of club champagne. Other treasures are accrued in more unexpected ways. In the Cavalry and Guards Club, for example, one can find a 16th century leather shoe. It was found in the attic of a former clubhouse, has no connection with the club or anything like that, but it's been kept there ever since. Why not? Well, enough background, so what I'd like to do now is to get a little deeper into some of the treasures, and I've chosen a little selection of what may be some less well-known items, and then we can see how we get on in terms of timing. So given my setting, I'd like to begin by referring to a treasure found in another yacht club here in London, the famous Royal Thames Yacht Club over in Knightsbridge, and that's actually where I gave the first talk I gave to support this book. The Thames, as the club is known to its members, is, I'm told, Europe's oldest continuously operating yacht club. It was established in 1775 when the country's yacht racing took place on the River Thames, which was rather wider at that time. From the mid-19th century, the Thames leased or owned properties in the West End before they purchased Hyde Park House, which is their current clubhouse, in 1923. The first thing which one notices when entering the clubhouse are a pair of handsome carved marble lions, one sleeping and one that looks ready to pounce. These are copies of Antonio Canova's sculptures which guard the tomb of Pope Clement XIII in Rome. Nearby there is a clock set into the wheel of a gun carriage from Nelson's one-time flagship, the HMS Foudroyant. Now that ship survived the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, only to be run aground in 1897 whilst functioning as a tourist attraction in Blackpool. Oh, the ignominy. A more impressive piece of Nelsonalia is a telescope, which once belonged to the One-Eyed Wonder. I'm told they did have two telescopes, but one was nicked a few years ago. Among the cases of yachting trophies, there are dozens and dozens of beautiful yachting trophies. There is the Emperor of Russia Rose Bowl, made by Fabergé, and presented by Tsar Nicholas II in 1909, and the huge Heligoland cups with their enamel portraits of Edward VII and Kaiser Wilhelm II. Well, Kaiser Bill donated those in 1912. His membership was terminated 2 years later, and no prizes for guessing why.
No.
There is a dedicated room stacked high with half-model yachts, part library and part art installation. This collection traces the development of the yacht design from the middle of the 19th century onwards. Well, boating enthusiasts like yourselves will no doubt find this an invaluable aid to academic research, but even the most scurvy landlubber can appreciate the picturesque scene. All those brightly coloured hulls, it looks like something one might find in the Tate Modern, but better conceived. A rarer treat in the clubhouse is the model of the Royal George displayed on the quarterdeck. This is one of about 400 models united by the exceptional circumstances behind their creation and by the materials which the craftsmen employed. These so-called bone ships were built by French prisoners of war during the Napoleonic Wars. They're made with animal bones, human hair, tortoise shells, ivory, and anything else which could be bartered, scavenged, whittled, buffed, and otherwise prodded into use. This is an early example of the genre. The Royal George was probably carved by a French sailor held in a West Country prison, such as Dartmoor or Exeter. Well, it seems peculiar, perhaps, that a prisoner of war would devote his time to creating a memorial to a warship that had belonged to his captors. But there are four possible reasons advanced by way of explanation. Firstly, that prisoner would have been terribly, terribly bored. In previous conflicts, there had been an active exchange of prisoners, but Napoleon put a stop to that, so the prisoner would have been aware he was there for years and years, there for the long haul. Secondly, many of the captured combatants had been skilled craftsmen before conscription, and so they had the time now perhaps to put those skills to practice. Thirdly, the staple diet of the prisoner was beef or mutton, with daily rations of up to half a pound of meat, which is quite incredible, really, isn't it? So there's plenty of animal bone left over to work with. The fourth reason was cold hard cash. The guards would help the prisoners to sell their models in special prison markets, and British ships were of course in greater demand than French ships. The models went for a tidy sum, and any profits went back to the prisoner, and they could use them to purchase little luxuries. The detail which one can observe on this ship is quite striking. The hull curves gracefully outwards as it meets the decks, which are stacked with dozens of minute cannons. The forecastle sweeps towards a tiny figurehead, 3 tapering masts and a thrusting bowsprit, and a forest of rigging are the works of supremely steady hands. The model's fabrication could have taken up to 6 months of labour. The whole thing is not more than a foot in length, but the detailing is impeccable, especially when one considers this was all completed from memory and with only the most rudimentary of tools. Well, what of the ship that the mariner chose to model? The Royal George in question was the 5th of 8 bearing that name, commissioned into the Royal Navy between 1675 and 1911. She was a first rate of 100 guns, launched at Chatham in 1788. She biffed the French in the Napoleonic Wars and also made an ill-fated expedition to bombard Constantinople. She was eventually broken up in 1822. It's just a whimsical thought, which is entirely undermined by research, that after decommissioning, she was used as a prison hulk, thereby acting obligingly as a sitter for the craftsmen who created this model. It's edifying to think of something so beautiful being produced in such unpromising conditions. Loveliness from squalor, creativity in captivity, new life from old bones. I think there might be a sermon in that. Well, back onto dry land, and I'd like to dip into a very different sort of treasure from White's, and White's is the world's longest lived club. For those who delight in clubs, White's requires not much of an introduction. The club's bow window, overlooking St James's, has seated some of the most famous and accomplished figures in British history, from Beau Brummell to Robert Peel, Evelyn Waugh to Cyril Connolly, David Niven to the Prince of Wales, who had his stag do at the club. His first stag do, anyway. Oh, sure, the Prince of Wales, of course, I mean the King. You can tell that I wrote this 2 years ago. The item on which I'd like to focus is the club's infamous betting book. Now, whilst not much to look at from the outside, when prized open, it reveals pearls of great price. In the club's Georgian heyday, the betting book was notorious both for the vastness and for the inventiveness of the members' wages. The aristocracy were far richer in the mid-18th century than they had been a generation previously, and they had access to generous credit from a growing number of banks. And so, flush with cash, the members of White's bet on anything and everything. They bet on births and deaths, on horses and divorces, on battles and hangings, on the strength of earthquakes and the pronunciation of French nouns. Even on one famous occasion, on which of two raindrops would be the first to reach the windowsill, with £3,000 in 1816, so that's £170,000 in today's money, at stake. One contemporary commented of White's members that, I quote, "They were not religious, but had any member become clairvoyant and announced the imminent sounding of the last trump, a book at once would have been opened on the event, with side bets taken on which of the archangels would be the one to sound it." Whilst many of the bets were frivolous, some were downright immoral. So Horace Walpole told the story of a man who fell ill on White's in front of the clubhouse. The members immediately began taking bets on whether he was alive or dead. And when it was proposed that someone send for a doctor to take the man's blood, those who had betted on his being dead objected, arguing it would prejudice the fairness of the wager. Walpole told another, even more disturbing tale. One of the youths at White's, he recorded, bet £1,000 that a man could live 12 hours underwater. He hired a desperate fellow, sunk him in a ship by way of experiment, and both ship and man have not appeared since. As the 19th century dawned, the quality of wages at White's stagnated. They became neither so ambitious nor so ruinous. As that great fictional cad, Harry Flashman, put it, the age of the Corinthian, the plunger and the dandy was giving way to that of the prig, the preacher and the bore. Nevertheless, White's has weathered all these storms. It still stands on St James's, and new volumes of its betting book continue to be filled. So for our next item, we're going to go to the Savage Club. The Savage is a fortress of old London bohemianism. Its emblem features a Native American chief brandishing a tomahawk. The members, who are all men, refer to each other as Brother Savage and are a hard-drinking, raucous bunch. This outlandishness is only emphasised by the fact that until recently they shared a room with the National Liberal Club, which is one of the more abstemious and progressive London clubs. Founded in 1853, the Savage began as a gathering of literary men. Various names were thrown about to try and capture the club's literary flavour. These included the Addison, the Johnson and the Goldsmith. However, when one member was so bold as to suggest the Shakespeare, another member cried out in frustration, "Don't let's be pretentious. If we must have a name, let it be a modest one." A third member thereby suggested the Savage, Richard Savage, having been a notorious producer of squalid verse, whose greatest claim to fame was that he once killed a man in a brawl. Well, the name was generally agreed to be a good one, and so the Savage Club was born in October 1857. Two savages from very different fields are commemorated in the clubhouse. Sir Alexander Fleming's Nobel Medal can be seen in a display case, and Sir Charlie Chaplin's cane hangs above the bar. Other famous savages have included James McNeill Whistler, Sir Henry Irving, Edward Elgar, J.M. Barrie, P.G. Woodhouse, and more royal dukes than you could, in good conscience and without fear of committing treason, shake a stick at. Compared to those luminaries, it might seem strange that a member whose memory looms largest in Savage Club folklore was at best a mediocrity. Edwin Jehoshaphat Odell, for that was his improbable name, was a second-rate character actor who could barely have been called a gentleman, and who was certainly not, in the conventional sense, a good club member. He was, however, a fine example of that most beloved of Clubland's denizens, the club eccentric. Old Odell is commemorated at the Savage in oils and marble, but his memory lives on most vividly in the chair from which he presided over club affairs for more than 40 years. A history of the Savage Club, written in 1907 when Odell was still alive, notes that, I quote, "He was a man of uncertain age. He has been entertained to dinner on his 70th, his 80th, and his 1904th birthdays. All these birthdays were comprised within 10 years, and the 70th came only the other day." Odell was a constant thorn in the side of the Savage Club committee. He barely spent a penny of his own money, but would rather sit in his chair close to the bar, wearing his customary black sombrero and cloak, and he would scrounge Irish whiskey and cigars from his fellow members. If offered a cigarette, he would thunder, "I do not smoke stationery." On one occasion, Odell borrowed £5 from a new member on his first visit to the club. After 6 months, the young man asked whether he might be reimbursed. "I haven't finished with it yet," came the reply. I like that story. That made it into the Times when the book was published. Odell's greatest performance came in 1928. In that year, the Duke of York attended a dinner at which he was elected an honorary life member. The Duke was treated to a typical programme of entertainments, including a Shakespearean soliloquy by Odell. After his performance, the vain old actor left. He refused to watch any of the other turns. He returned to the Savage about 11 p.m. Thrusting his way cantankerously through the crowd, Odell headed towards his customary chair, only to find that it was occupied by the newly elected Royal Savage. Livid with rage and waving his arms wildly, Odell shouted, "Out of my chair, sir! Get out at once!" The Duke obliged, removing himself apologetically to the bar, making the customary throne available to the obviously eccentric patriarch. And that was to be Odell's last great show. He died 4 months later. When he had been buried, his brother Savages affixed to that same chair a plaque in his memory. It states plainly but affectionately the facts of the matter. Here old Odell sat. In all their subsequent moves, they've moved about 14 times, the chair has followed the Savages and remains among their most treasured possessions. It stands as a reminder that in Clubland, sheer pig-headed longevity counts for more than birth, titles, manners or money. Let that be a cautionary tale for any royal dukes who might be in the audience. Well, we've now reached the juncture where I can keep on talking. This is the besetting sin of the clergy. We like the sound of our own voices. I could talk about the axe wielded by William Gladstone in the National Liberal, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's haunted snooker cue at the Harrogate Club, the suit of African chainmail at the East India. But I want to conclude matters by going off script and across the pond to the Players Club in New York. So in the book, I've only focused on items in British clubs, mostly in London and then several in the provinces. So this is a bonus extra just for you fine fellows here. The Players Club in New York was founded in the second half of the 19th century for actors, sort of the American equivalent of the Garrick Club. It was founded by a man called Edwin Booth. I wonder, is the name Edwin Booth familiar to anyone? He was in his day a great actor, one of these great Victorian actor managers who was regularly on the front page of newspapers. He was quite a lonely man in common with a lot of performers, and so he decided that he would build a club and he would live on the first floor, and underneath it there would be a sort of open house and members would come and go and he would be entertained continually. He died quite young, and his flat remained as it was the day he died. It still is to this day. You go in there now, 120 years later, it's exactly the same as it was the day he died. And there are two items of particular interest. The first thing to note is a framed photograph of his brother by the side of his bed. Well, his brother was John Wilkes Booth. Again, that might be a name perhaps more people are familiar with. John Wilkes Booth was an actor himself, but of course is more famous for having shot Abraham Lincoln. And when John Wilkes Booth assassinated the president, the news spread that a Booth had killed the president, but which Booth no one knew. And so people thought that it might actually be Edwin Booth. So he wrote a letter very hurriedly to be printed in all the papers saying, it wasn't me, it was my brother that did it. And eventually, of course, John Wilkes Booth was hunted down and was put to death. But Edwin Booth continued to love his brother to his dying day and had that photograph beside his bed. The second item of interest is a human skull. Now, why would an actor need a human skull? For playing Hamlet, of course, and this was the role for which Edwin Booth was most famous. He was a great sort of Shakespearean tragedist, and he did, in fact, 101 straight performances of Hamlet at Madison Square Gardens. This was international news in his day. The skull itself initially belonged to his father, the wonderfully named Junius Brutus Booth. And Junius Brutus Booth had himself been a famous actor in the first half of the 19th century. And Junius Brutus Booth was part of a touring Shakespearean theatre company that travelled west as America expanded and would perform Shakespeare to one-horse towns and possibly no-horse towns as well. And of course, in those days, really the only thing that people knew was the Bible and Shakespeare. People knew these plays off by heart, and so they attracted huge crowds. And one day in a town in the American Midwest, a man was caught for cattle rustling, and the sheriff said he was to be put to death by hanging and asked if he had any last wishes. And he said, yes, I went to see a wonderful play called Hamlet last year, and I wonder if, when I'm dead, my head could be severed from my body and the skull could be sent to Junius Brutus Booth, so that when he's playing Hamlet, he could use my skull as Yorick. And the sheriff said, fine, sensible request. So the head was taken from him and decomposed and all the rest of it, sent to this actor, and he did use it. And then when he died, he gave that skull to his son. And his son, Edwin Booth, the founder of the Players Club, used it in his famous 101 straight performances of Hamlet at Madison Square Garden. And it's still there now in the Players Club, and you can go see it. So I thought that was a rather macabre, but quite fascinating story to show the way in which every club has its treasures. You go and sort of seek them out. So on that note, I suppose I'll take some questions before. Yes, I can sit and I'll sign the books. And I should say, I'll give you a discount. This sells for £13, but I'll sell it for 11. And I've been haggled down. We'll say £10. It's easier. So I'll sell it for a tenner, and I'll sign it, which devalues it. So that's why it's £3 less. But yes. So any questions? Yes.
What sparked your interest in clubs? Being out in Wales, what was your connection to the London clubs?
I know, as an exile out in Wales, it was I initially got into it. I had a very strange job when I first left university. I was a perfume salesman in Kazakhstan, as you do, and I would often be back in London, and I didn't have my family lives in Worcestershire, and so I don't have a base in London. And I hated lugging around suitcases, and so I was eligible to join the Oxford and Cambridge Club because I'd been to Oxford, and they're very good rates for sort of under 25s, which I then was. So I joined, and I love the idea of being part of this heritage, and you get this essentially a palace which you part own, and you can go in. So I loved it, and that really sparked the interest. And then the immediate catalyst for writing the book was I went during the summer. I'm not sure the same here, but we have sort of reciprocal memberships with various other clubs in August. And I went into the Caledonian Club, which is a sort of Scottish club and they have this fantastic ram's head snuff box, which is an entire taxidermied ram's head with a little snuff box sort of crown on its head. And I thought, this is so grotesque and so interesting. And it was also given as a war memorial. It was given in memory by the club president. His son was shot down in the Royal Flying Corps in 1916. I thought, well, this is fascinating. I find it interesting. Presumably other people might find it interesting. So really that was the initial interest in clubs, and then I thought, well, that gives me the idea for a sort of niche but hopefully entertaining book.
I've been to the East India Club and seen this chainmail, African chainmail. What's the story behind that?
You've got to buy the book. Well, no, it's an interesting story because the sort of short, interesting story is, as early as the early 20th century, a lot of African armies were still wearing chainmail, both for ceremonial purposes, but also on the battlefield. And there was a story which apparently has been found to be true in sort of 1904 of a Nigerian warlord using arms from the Fifth Crusade, and they had these swords and these helmets and suits of armour which were 500 years old, and still using them in combat. So this is a jerkin of chainmail which had been taken by a member of the East India Club, who was a young lieutenant, and who went out on one of the sort of imperial campaigns in Africa, and he either shot or found this suit of chainmail. So you can see the bullet hole from where the soldier wearing it had been shot by a British rifle. So again, it's something very macabre, and they've moved it into the bar. It had been sort of hidden away upstairs, along with sort of rows and rows of taxidermy. But so it has a fascinating story behind it, and yeah, well worth going to see. So thank you for asking about that one.
Did you manage to sell any perfume?
It's a good question. Unrelated, if you don't mind me saying. But, I did. Well, actually, perhaps you can ask me this over dinner, because it's a fairly long story. But yeah, the whole thing went belly up. My boss fell out with the president of Kazakhstan, and so therefore I couldn't sell anything in the end. But yeah, so it initially worked quite well, but I ended up spending about 6 months of not doing any work and having a really good time. I joined a choir and I made friends with all these nuns and the US Marine Corps, and I had a very interesting life out there, but no, I'm not a very successful perfume salesman, so I thought I'll become a priest instead. Yes?
So how many clubs are you member of?
Well, what am I member of? I'm apparently an honorary membership here now, so which is wonderful. Not yet, that's true. I could say really horrible things and not get that. So I remember the Savile Club is my club. I remember the Swansea Yacht Club, which is, it's not really a proper club, and then a couple of dining clubs that I'm a member of as well. But unfortunately, my stipend doesn't allow me to join as many clubs as I might like. But so I'm thrilled to also hopefully be joining here as well. So that's that. Mm.
Some of them are difficult to get into. What sort of reception did you get when you said you were doing research on this book?
Well, I was surprised actually how accommodating people were, and I made it very clear this is in no way an expose of sinister goings on behind closed doors. This is nothing other than, I hope, an entertaining and light-hearted sort of account of ephemera, really. And so I got, by and large, very positive responses. I think only 2 clubs asked not to be included because they thought it might be. They didn't want any sort of publicity. Of course, there's a lot of public information out there, particularly the more famous clubs, White's and Boodle and Brooks. There are books published. But most of the clubs, I have to say, were very, very happy to let me in and come down and buy me lunch and talk about it. And so it's been great. I call it research, but that makes it sound like I've been sort of slogging away in a dusty library somewhere. I've just had a great time. Most of the research was done at the bar. But most people were very, very happy to have me in, actually.
Unless there are any other questions, I'd like to say that the Ala Whites, the winner of the sweepstake on how long Sam was going to talk tonight, will be announced later. But can we thank Sam in the usual way, and I hope that perhaps you'll be around for some further questions after dinner, if there are any more. But thank Sam in the usual way. The special price of £10.
That's right. I've been haggled down. I shall sit here.
I shall certainly.
Well done. And boom. Yeah.